For decades, one shipping company was the only comfortable way from New York to South America's west coast. Passengers dined under a glass roof that slid open to the stars while their liner slipped past the Panama Canal. Elizabeth Taylor booked a cabin. Rival lines copied the model. Then, within about 10 years, every one of those ships was gone. Sold, scrapped, or tied up for good at a Virginia dock. The easy answer is jets killed it. That's not wrong. It's just too small. The real killer was a steel box the company built first, then had to abandon. That's Grace Line. And if you only know the jet version of this story, you know maybe a third of it. Here's the part that gets skipped. Jets explain why passengers stopped booking cabins. They do not explain why the company that owned those ships disappeared entirely. Cargo business, brand, corporate identity, all of it, inside the same decade. A company doesn't vanish just because one type of customer switched to airplanes. Something deeper had to break first, and it did, years before most people were paying attention, in a place with nothing glamorous about it at all. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back to a very unglamorous place, not a shipyard. A guano pile. In 1854, an Irish immigrant named William Russell Grace was building a trading business out of Callao, Peru, exporting bird droppings. That's not a joke. Guano was one of the most valuable fertilizers on Earth at the time, and Grace built an empire, moving it out of the Chincha Islands to farms in Europe and North America. He later moved to New York, chartered W.R. Grace and Company there, and was twice elected mayor of the city in 1880 and 1884. In 1885, as mayor, he was the one who formally accepted the Statue of Liberty on New York's behalf. A fertilizer trader from Peru welcomed the most famous symbol of arrival in American history. That's where the story actually starts. Decades before the first Santa-named ship ever touched water. Grace's trading company kept moving goods up and down the west coast of South America, and by the 1890s, it had moved into steamships to carry that trade itself instead of paying someone else to do it. Passenger service came later, almost as an afterthought, bolted onto a freight operation. And that detail matters far more than it sounds like it should, because it's the key to what Grace Line actually was. Here's the twist most people miss. Grace Line was never really a cruise company. It looked like one, especially later, with the white hulls, the orchestras, and the movie stars. But underneath, it was a cargo company that happened to carry people. And once you see it that way, everything that eventually goes wrong makes a lot more sense. The ships hauled coffee, bananas, refrigerated Chilean fruit, and general freight down to Peru and Chile, then came back up loaded again for New York. Passengers rode along in staterooms, bolted onto what was, structurally, a freighter's business model. The cargo paid the bills, the passengers made it glamorous. Take away either half, and the other half stopped making sense on its own. That combination made perfect sense in a world where cargo moved at the speed of a crane and a longshoreman's back. In the early 20th century, loading a ship took days, sometimes longer. Freight and passengers traveled at roughly the same pace because both were limited by exactly the same slow, manual process on the docks. If you were shipping bananas to New York, you might as well put 100 people in staterooms on the same hull because the ship wasn't going anywhere fast, regardless. Nobody was in more of a hurry than the ship itself. So Grace built an entire identity around that overlap. In 1916, it launched dedicated passenger service to the west coast of South America with 5 ships. The Panama Canal, opened in 1914, made the whole route viable, cutting out the long detour around Cape Horn. Picture what New York's own waterfront looked like in that era. Finger piers packed shoulder to shoulder along the Hudson and East Rivers. Longshoremen loading crates and banana stems by hand, gang by gang, ship by ship. That world moved on human muscle and dock schedules, not clocks, and Grace's entire business existed inside that rhythm. In 1929, Grace even co-founded an airline, Panagra, with Pan American, betting on the sky at the same time it was still building on the sea, which tells you the company wasn't blind to where travel was heading. It just assumed it could run both businesses at once, forever. By the early 1930s, Grace had its signature fleet, the Big Four, led by the new Santa Rosa and Santa Paula, Delivered in 1932 and 1933, designed by the naval architect William Francis Gibbs, who would later design the SS United States. These liners had a retractable glass roof over the dining room, so first-class passengers could eat under open sky. Female dining room waitresses, unusual for the era. All outside cabins. It was, for its market, the closest thing to floating modernity that money could buy. World War II interrupted everything. The liners were requisitioned as troop ships, some capable of carrying well over 2,000 soldiers at a time. Two of the big four, Santa Lucia and Santa Elena, were sunk in military service. Only Santa Rosa and Santa Paula came home. After the war, Grace rebuilt aggressively, adding 9 new combination ships that each carried 52 first-class passengers alongside refrigerated banana cargo. At its post-war peak, the company operated 23 ships totaling 188,000 gross tons, plus 14 more on charter. That's not a boutique operator. That's one of the largest American flag fleets serving Latin America, full stop, and one of the most recognizable liveries on the New York waterfront. That green funnel with the white band was as familiar downtown as any airline's tail logo would later become. In 1958, Grace launched brand new versions of its 2 flagship names, the 3rd Santa Rosa and 3rd Santa Paula, built at Newport News, carrying roughly 300 first-class passengers each, with some of the largest swimming pools at sea and interiors designed by the textile artist Dorothy Liebes. Pat Nixon christened one of them. Elizabeth Taylor sailed on one. This was the company at its cultural peak. If you wanted the classiest, most modern American flag passage to Haiti, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, or Chile, Grace Line was the answer. And on some of those routes, it was close to the only answer. And it wasn't alone in looking unstoppable. On the East Coast, Moore McCormick Lines ran a nearly identical model down to Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, marketed as the Good Neighbor Fleet. Same glamour, same combination cargo passenger structure, same total confidence in the future. 2 American shipping companies, both convinced they'd built something permanent. Watch what happens to both of them, because it's the same story, told twice, on 2 different coastlines, on almost the same timeline. Meanwhile, a very different kind of competitor was quietly rewriting the rules of cargo shipping altogether, and it wasn't even trying to compete for passengers. In 1956, a trucking entrepreneur named Malcolm McLean loaded steel boxes onto a converted tanker and sailed it from Newark to Houston. That's the first container shipment in American history. Sealand, the company that grew out of it, could move cargo faster, cheaper, and with a fraction of the labor Grace's ships needed to load or unload. Matson Navigation did something similar out on the Hawaii trade starting in 1958. Neither company was trying to out-glamour Grace Line. They were making Grace's entire cost structure look ancient, one converted freighter at a time. And here's where people get the timeline wrong. The public story says Grace Line died because jets took the passengers away. But the real crack opened years before that, quietly, in a place nobody outside the shipping trade was watching, a dock in Venezuela. In January 1960, Grace spent $3.5 million converting 2 of its own freighters, Santa Eliana and Santa Leonor, into cellular container ships. One of the first American attempts to bring containerization into international foreign flag trade rather than just coastal domestic routes. Santa Eliana loaded 176 containers at Port Newark and sailed for La Guaira, Venezuela. It should have been the future arriving early for Grace, a company getting ahead of a shift the rest of the industry was still figuring out. Instead, Venezuelan dock workers, terrified the steel boxes would erase their jobs, refused to unload the ship. After an 18-day standoff, Grace backed down and agreed not to run container ships on that route again. A second attempt in 1962 failed too. By 1964, Grace had sold both converted ships to Sealand. The company that pioneered the container in foreign trade ended up handing that technology straight to the rival who would help finish the job on everyone else. That sounds like a footnote. It isn't. It's the moment the company's cargo economics started dying, while its passenger fleet still looked like it was in its prime 3 years into service on the brand new Santas. Grace had correctly seen the future. It just wasn't allowed to reach it. And once it walked away from containers, it was stuck running the most expensive, most labor-heavy version of ocean shipping left standing in the industry, right as the rest of that industry was becoming radically cheaper to operate without it. From here, the pressure doesn't come from one direction. It comes from everywhere at once. And that's exactly why no single explanation ever fully covers what happened. Start with the jets. The Boeing 707 entered commercial service in October 1958, the same year Grace launched its brand new Santas. Within a couple of years, a trip that took Grace's ships weeks took an airplane a single day. Passengers who once had no real choice suddenly had an easy one, and an obvious one. That alone would have hurt badly. Then there's the subsidy trap, which sounds like help and behaves like a leash. Grace's ships operated under federal construction and operating subsidies created by the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, meant to help American flag shipping survive against cheaper foreign flag competitors. Nationally, those operating subsidies were costing the government something like $140 million a year by the early 1960s, just to keep American flagships competitive with foreign crews and foreign wages. That sounds like protection. It wasn't. Not entirely. The subsidy came with strings attached, fixed itineraries, required sailing frequency, no flexibility to chase seasonal demand. Foreign lines without those subsidies could shift their ships into lucrative winter Caribbean cruising whenever regular bookings dried up in the off-season. Grace, tied to its subsidized schedule, couldn't do the same. The help that was supposed to keep it competitive quietly locked it into a shape it could no longer afford to keep, year after year. And Grace wasn't the only one wearing that leash. Moore McCormick, running the same combination model down the other coast of South America, hit the same wall on almost the same calendar, and its own liners were laid up in 1969, the very same year Grace Line was sold off. 2 companies, 2 coastlines, 1 trap. Then containerization, industry-wide, kept accelerating with or without Grace's participation. Every year, Grace stayed out of it after the Venezuela standoff. Competitors moved cargo cheaper and faster without it. Combination passenger cargo ships, the exact model that had made Grace glamorous in the first place, were now the slowest, costliest way to move freight in the entire business. The arrangement that once let cargo revenue quietly subsidize the passenger decks had flipped into dead weight, dragging the whole operation down. At the same time, the company's own parent, W.R. Grace & Company, was choosing a different future entirely, on purpose. Latin American shipping and trade had made up roughly 60% of the parent company's business back in the 1950s. By 1962, that share had fallen to just 19%, as leadership deliberately pushed the broader conglomerate into chemicals instead. This wasn't decline by accident or bad luck. Somebody upstairs was actively steering money away from ships year after year toward a completely different kind of company. And then politics made the exit look smarter by the day. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 spooked American businesses operating across Latin America. Peru began nationalizing Grace's remaining assets there starting in 1969. A company built entirely on stability in Latin American ports was watching that stability disappear country by country, right as it was trying to figure out what its ships were even for anymore. There's one more detail that says everything about which way the wind was blowing inside the company. Remember Panagra, the airline Grace co-founded back in 1929, the one built to fly the very passengers its ships used to carry? Between 1965 and 1967, Grace sold its half of that airline to Braniff. The company that once hedged its bets between sea and sky quietly cashed out of the sky business right as air travel was finishing off its ships. That's not proof of one motive, but it's hard to look at and not see a company that had already decided internally which side of this fight it was going to lose. Stack all of that up, and look at it together. Jets alone, survivable. Subsidy handcuffs alone, survivable. Missing the container shift alone, survivable. Barely with enough time. A parent company quietly walking away, plus political risk pulling the ground out from under the whole business model. Put all of it together, and there was no version of Graceline left standing. Each pressure on its own was a wound. Together, they were a company with nowhere left to go. So in December 1969, Graceline was sold to Prudential Lines for $44.5 million. Sit with that number next to 23 ships and 188,000 tons at its post-war peak. That's what was left by the time the deal closed. The renamed company, Prudential Gracelines, took its new name in January 1970 under a new president, Spiros Skouras. It was framed publicly as a fresh start for a great American shipping name. It was really a handoff, one company quietly passing a problem to another. Passenger service didn't survive long past that. In January 1971, Santa Paula was laid up at Hampton Roads, Virginia on the 16th of the month. Santa Rosa followed about a week later. 2 ships, 6 days apart, and the entire long story of Grace passenger travel to South America was over. Not a slow fade, a shutdown. What happened to the ships afterward tells its own story, better than any headline could. The original 1932 Santa Rosa and Santa Paula had already been sold off to Greek owners years earlier. The 4 newer M-class freighters Grace had built in the mid-1960s, Santa Magdalena, Santa Mariana, Santa Maria, and Santa Mercedes, kept working cargo routes and even carried a small number of passengers into the 1980s, before passing to Delta Line in 1977 and finally ending Santa-named passenger service altogether by 1984. The 1958 Santa Paula eventually became a floating hotel in Kuwait and was destroyed during the Iraqi invasion in 1990 and 1991. The 1958 Santa Rosa went through a $70 million rebuild in the early 1990s, sailed on as a cruise ship into the 2000s, and was finally beached and scrapped at Alang, India in 2012. The last American-built passenger liner still sailing, at last gone for good. The Grace name itself lingered a little longer, almost like a ghost still wearing the old company's clothes. Prudential Grace kept operating cargo service through most of the 1970s. In 1978, it was absorbed into Delta Steamship Lines, and the Grace name disappeared from ocean shipping entirely. The brand had already survived 7 years past the thing that made it famous. That's worth sitting with for a second. The name Grace Line kept existing on paperwork and funnels for years after the actual passenger network, the ships, the routes, the schedules people planned their lives around was already gone. A logo is not a company. A name painted on a hull is not a service running underneath it. None of this stayed abstract to the people who actually depended on it. For travelers heading to Haiti or the Andean coast, Grace wasn't a luxury option among many. For a lot of those routes, it was close to the only scheduled, comfortable American flag choice there was, at fares that in the late 1960s ran a few $100s each way, first class to La Guaira, more than $500 up from Callao. When it ended, so did that access all at once. Crew members and shipboard staff who'd built careers around Grace's sailing schedule were suddenly out of a U.S. flag job in January 1971 with nowhere identical to go. Some of those officers and hostesses had spent decades learning one company's ships, one company's ports, one company's rhythm, and none of that experience transferred cleanly to an industry that was shrinking everywhere at once. Containerization gutted the docks that fed them, and this wasn't only about the ships themselves. Longshore employment in New York fell by roughly 75% between 1963 and 1976. That's not a Grace-specific number. It's the whole waterfront the company depended on, quietly emptying out underneath it while the world moved to New Jersey. Piers that had been loud with cargo gangs for 100 years went quiet within a decade. Port cities like Callao, Valparaiso, Guayaquil, Cartagena, and La Guaira lost their regular link to New York. The kind of connection that had structured trade and travel there for generations, replaced by container schedules that ran without a single passenger cabin on board. Here's the part that still bothers me. Grace Line didn't fail because nobody wanted what it offered. People kept wanting comfortable, reliable passage to places jets didn't reach as gracefully, and cargo customers kept wanting reliable freight service just as much as ever. The company failed because the model that made it work, cargo and passengers sharing the same ship, the same schedule, the same slow rhythm of loading and unloading, stopped making economic sense the moment cargo could move without any of that. Grace saw it coming. It even tried to build the fix in Venezuela in 1960, spending real money to get there first. It just wasn't allowed to arrive in time, and by the time it might have tried again, the rest of its business had already started falling apart around it. Zoom out, and Grace Line isn't really a story about ocean liners at all. It's a story about what happens when a business is built on a temporary alignment. The moment cargo and people happen to move at exactly the same speed, and that alignment quietly ends. Subsidies that were supposed to protect American shipping instead locked it into shapes it couldn't change fast enough to survive. A technology the company itself helped pioneer got taken away by the very labor resistance that container shipping would eventually roll straight through anyway, everywhere else, a few years later. And a parent company, watching all of it happen in real time, simply chose to leave rather than fight for a business that had already stopped being the future. That's not a story unique to Grace Line. It's the story of a lot of transportation systems that served the people with fewer alternatives. Travelers to smaller ports, workers on the docks, towns that depended on one reliable link to the outside world. When a system like that stops being profitable enough, it doesn't usually get rescued. It gets sold, renamed, folded into something else until the name quietly outlives the thing it used to mean. Nobody signs a document that says, "We are choosing to let this die." It just happens one subsidy rule, one missed technology, one strategic pivot at a time, and by the time it's finished, it looks inevitable in hindsight, even though almost none of it actually was. If you ever sailed with Grace Line to the Caribbean, to Peru, to Chile, or if someone in your family worked those New York docks before the containers took over, or you remember hearing about the day one of those Santas didn't sail again, put it in the comments. Companies like this don't leave much of an official record behind. Sometimes the comment section really is the only archive that's left. Somewhere out past the Statue of Liberty, the Water Grace's white-hulled liners used to cross is still moving right on schedule, the same as it always was. The ships just aren't on it anymore.